Welcome back to the Rocket Tutorial Part 5. This is building on our last tutorial where we added colliders to our asteroids and we added a particle effect so that they would explode and spawn smaller asteroids. So here we go. You can watch this in action real quick just to recap what we did last time. We also added the screen wraparound effect so that they will wrap around and hit each other instead of floating off endlessly into space. Another thing that we want to do is make sure that they can't move in the z-axis. So because this is a 2D game, we're going to want to keep them constrained to the x and y axis. So let's go ahead and do that. Just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to do. We're going to start with just modifying the asteroids a little bit and then making sure that they can explode with the rocket scene. Then we'll move on to other things like health, projectiles, heads-up displays, or on-screen overlays for scores and health and things like that in the coming tutorials. So let's go ahead and get started here. So another housekeeping thing I like to do, which I haven't really been focused on much here, is just making sure I have my directory structure set up. So I'm going to create a new folder in my hierarchy. I'm going to call it Prefabs. And I'm going to drop one of these prefabs in here. And I'll just make it the original prefab. I'm going to call it Asteroid instead of the crazy name that it had. Okay. So now this asteroid should reflect everything that's up here. It should have all of our components. And I'm going to go ahead and just delete these two real quick. And I'll re-add this. So this is just a little cleaner here. And I'll add a couple of these just for the sake of this scene. Now, while we didn't see this happen before because our script is pushing these guys in random x and y directions, it's still possible for these things to shoot off in the z direction because they're not locked. So one quick thing we can do is go into our Asteroid Prefab. And now, if you don't have much experience with prefabs, the nice thing about prefabs is that you can edit them once in their root or original prefab, and that can permeate all the other prefabs. So you don't have to go around editing every object in your scene. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the rigid body component on my prefab, and I'm going to find constraints. I'm going to freeze the Z position. And so that should keep these guys from shooting off toward or away from the camera. So let's go ahead and play that. Well, actually, let's just have a look and see. I'm going to go ahead and select the prefabs in the scene, and you can see that the constraint Z position is checked off on all of these prefabs, even though I changed it down here. So if I came in and I changed the Y, you can see that it's been updated in the scene. So this is really nice. You build a template of an object and then you can drop it into any scene and then modify the template when you have to. And you can also modify these outside of the template. They then become disconnected from the template, but you can still use them as part of the template as a base and then build on that. So I did notice one thing with the particle effects. I mentioned this in the last tutorial. They're shooting in different directions and they look like they have some gravity. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that particle effect, the big explosion effect. And because this is a particle effect and it's a prefab, just looking at it in the project hierarchy doesn't give you the full view of this particle effect. So I'm just going to drop it into our scene. I'll reset its position so it's right there in the middle. And we'll take a look. You can see that there are quite a few different parts to this particle effect. But you see how these embers are flying off, or these little fires are flying off and then they're falling down. We don't want that to happen. So anywhere there's gravity assigned, which here in the root there isn't any gravity assigned, And I don't believe there's anything else. Well, let's have a look. The shape doesn't matter. Velocity over time. Let's see. Okay, so the velocity over time on the Y is moving. Let's just put that at 0. So let's just move through these. Gravity modifier. There's 1. The debris. So let's set that to 0. And now you can see it's shooting straight out. That's pretty good. I don't know if there are any other parts to this particle effect that may be pulling in weird directions, but I think this is good enough for me right now. Feel free to go through and you know, play with this particle effect so that you have it the way you like it. Now, because this is a prefab, and I've just modified this outside of the prefab, so I dragged it in a scene, I modified it. It's going to have this overrides up here. This drop down allows you to either revert back to the original prefab or apply all these changes to the new prefab. Just to keep this original prefab as it was, I'm going to go to my prefabs folder. I'm going to create a new prefab out of this. And I'm going to make it based on the prefab variant I used. So we'll go ahead and delete that out of the scene. We'll check our asteroid prefab and make sure that we have the variant in our asteroid. So now let's crash these things together. And let's just make sure. Okay. Great. It does look a little weird because there are 2 explosions every time these things collide. But in general, I think with your rocket, you'll be shooting at them. And if we need to, we can have something fire off the explosion once two asteroids have collided, as opposed to having the asteroids themselves fire off the explosion. Okay, so I think that's good for this scene. If you want, I mean, feel free to play around in the scene. I'm going to go back to my scenes folder, and I'm going to find my main scene. And now I'm going to drop in some asteroids. Now, one of the things about this, and I'll go ahead and play, and you'll see. Let's make this asteroid bigger. Maybe we'll make it huge. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and play it. And we will just shoot right on over here. Oh, well, look at that. Let's just shoot right through. And look, either we're going behind it or we're going through it. Either way, it doesn't seem right. So you can see we can go right through this thing. All right, that's because our rocket does not have a collider on it. So there are several ways you can do this. If you want to get really accurate, you can use a mesh collider. The mesh collider is the wireframe of the object used as a collider. Now, because it's a non-uniform shape, it will cost more to test for collisions. So having to detect something intersecting with any of the tries on your model will be more expensive CPU-wise than doing a generic shape. So I've come up with Capsule Collider after doing some testing. And this seemed to be the best collider I could find. So I'm going to change the radius and and I'm going to adjust the height. Now you can see this is not on the right axis, and I want it on the z-axis. There we go. So you can see that comes pretty close. I'm going to adjust the radius down a little bit, and maybe height. That's pretty good there. So you can copy these numbers, or you can just eyeball it, which is what I did. I'll do 10.75. And now let's test it. Okay. So there you can see these guys explode. Okay. And just for fun, you can go ahead and drop a bunch of these in. And let's actually, we can maybe drag out 3 of them and then duplicate them. So shift, select, and then you can grab a bunch of these guys. And Control D as you have them selected. That will give you a copy of everything. So Control D, you can see everything's just duplicating there. Control D. Okay. So this is very similar to the scene I showed you initially when I was presenting what we're going to build over several video tutorials. So the next thing to do is work out our scaling issues. So as you can see, flying through this, our explosions seem pretty wimpy. The size of our asteroids, once they spawn new asteroids, are way too small. So let's go into our script, and actually I'll just load it up from here. Rocket player controller is the wrong script. We're going to grab the Asteroid Controller. Let's get this organized. So I kind of like to have my controller, my scripts, as high as possible in the stack. Let me just drop it right there. And actually it wants us to do that in the prefab. So let's go ahead and open the prefab. And I'm just going to, let's collapse all of these guys. There we go. So then I'll just scoot it up to the top, right above the transform. I mean, above the cube mesh filter. Okay, now we've got it open. So what we're going to do is base our scale of our generated asteroids off of the scale of the asteroid in the scene. So looking through the script, we're getting to the generate new asteroids method. And in here, the first thing I noticed is my random range is between 0.25 and 1.5, which means that our new asteroids generated could be bigger than our original asteroid. So let's get that down to 0.75. So that's 3/4 the size of our original asteroid. And the next thing we want to do is make sure that the scale of our new asteroid is the random size that we pick times our current size, not times 1. So let's go ahead and erase that. And we're going to do local scale times the random scale back, set it back to its local scale. Okay, so if this line is confusing, it's the same as writing all of this. So it's just multiplying itself times the random scale and setting it back to its local scale property. So it's a lot cleaner when you see that right there. But feel free to write it whichever way you want. Okay, the next thing we want to do is update the random unit sphere position. So right now it's a unit sphere times 2. Well, if this thing is bigger than 1 unit or 2 units, then our new asteroids are going to be generated within the inside of one of these asteroids. So we want it to be outside of the asteroid, at least the size of the asteroid itself. So we're going to change this to the asteroid local transform, and I'm going to use the Y value of the local scale. Sorry, not transform, but the scale. So that will give us the unit sphere, which is 1, times the scale. So if this is 4, it'll be 4 plus its position. So it'll be random place within the unit sphere times the local scale plus the position of this object. Okay, so that should give us a fairly good scale on these asteroids. So let's go ahead and play this and test it real quick. There we go. So the asteroids look like they're pretty good in size. Okay, so the next thing that I see here that we need to fix is this crazy explosion. So let's go back to our code. And you know what, we can erase these commented lines here. Just to clean up our code a little bit. And inside our play explosion method, it's a coroutine. We want to go ahead and scale our explosion as well. So we're going to hit the transform.local scale, and we're going to set it to equals the current transform of our object times local scale. Again, we're going to use the Y component, and that will scale our explosion up to the same scale as our current object. Now, I'm using the Y component. I'm assuming that our asteroid is scaled uniformly, meaning that its X, Y, and Z are all scaled the same amount. If that's not the case, you may want to use a different value for this. But for now, the Y component should work. All right, so let's give that a test. Okay, those explosions are a lot bigger. You can see these flares are flying all over the place. And maybe that's not exactly what we want, but I'm going to leave that alone for now. But so it does look pretty good, I think. All right. So I'm going to leave it there. And, oh, there's actually one last thing I want to do before we go. So I'm going to go into the rocket, and I'm going to find its Capsule Collider, and I'm going to set it to a trigger. So that will just make sure that instead of causing a physics reaction, we're just firing off a trigger when there's a collision that happens. Okay, now I'm going to leave it there. And in the next tutorial, I'm going to start planning and implementing health and damage. And we will get into things like projectiles and some overlay graphics to show us our score and our damage, and eventually we'll get into a menu system so we can get in and out of the gameplay and set some rules for the game so that it will end and get progressively harder. But for now, we have our rocket scene. We've got a bunch of asteroids in here, and you can fly around and destroy the asteroids, which in itself is kind of fun. All right. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please subscribe if you're not subscribed, and feel free to leave me any comments or questions. And I'm happy to take any recommendations for new tutorials. Thanks. I'll see you in the next tutorial.